Welcome to Cybersecurity from Scratch, Technical Foundations, Episode 10, Password Security. In today's episode, we'll first talk about the attack workflow that attackers will use when trying to penetrate systems by compromising passwords, and then we'll talk about how to disrupt this attack chain. When an attacker is trying to penetrate a system which is protected by a password, there are several techniques that can be used for getting the password. The first of these is known password use, where ideally the attacker already knows the password from somewhere else and then uses it to log in. We also have the option that attackers will exploit the password recovery mechanism within the system, where they're using other stolen information to recover the password. Sometimes they'll attempt to brute force the user interface by directly testing passwords. This attack often relies on knowing other passwords that the user might be utilizing, as the brute force of a UI requires a substantially limited password set. Attackers may also be able to gain access to the system through some other vector, steal the hash where the password is stored, and then crack it, which will then allow the attacker to log back into the system using the stolen credential. If the attacker can gain access to a user's password without actually having to attack the system at all, then they can simply log in, and the user profile from the system's perspective is very nominal. They are simply presented with the username and password, and everything is fine. Often the first step that the attacker will take is testing system defaults. Often lazy administrators simply won't change the username and password that comes with the system, such as admin or whatever the defaults might be. Moving a step beyond this, the attacker will attempt to identify what usernames might be. Often they'll be looking for a specific user, but sometimes it doesn't really matter who the user is as long as they have a user that they can attack. Once a username is identified, the attacker can do some background research, figure out who the user is, and find some password candidates. And then finally, of course, is the attack sequence where the candidate credentials can be tested and access gained. Default admin credentials are still a problem in many modern systems. Even though the common practice these days is to build systems that don't have default credentials and prompt the user to define their own credentials, it still happens. Sometimes default credentials will exist and the user may not even know. For example, I installed a monitoring service one time that had an undocumented admin account. The only reason I knew that it existed is I asked the vendor point blank if they had any backdoors in it, and the answer was yes. Needless to say, I don't use that system anymore, but the point stands that you need to check to make sure that there are admin accounts installed by default that may or may not be exposed, and just ask the vendor if they might have put something in there that you don't know about. The first step in attacking a user account for the attacker is figuring out what the username is. Now, they might be looking for just any old user, looking through public content to see what the usernames that are posted to blog entries or so on and so forth, or they might be using information that's gleaned from those usernames to find out what a username generation scheme is that could be used to isolate a specific user. Generally speaking, you don't want to broadcast the usernames of your users, just this makes it one step easier for attackers to gain access. Once the attacker has a username or someone's actual identity, finding another password that they use can be surprisingly simple. One of the most straightforward methods is to buy password dumps on the darknet from other compromised sites. Often users will use the same password from site to site, and it can be fairly trivial to guess a password for a new site based off of an old site's hack. Often, attackers will also scrape forums and paste bins for passwords and build up a credential database. Oftentimes, hackers, once they compromise databases, will post little snippets of 100, 200 credentials or something like that. And for attackers who are watching this over time, they can eventually build up a fairly substantial credential database. Another technique attackers might use is directly attack another system that the user utilizes that has weaker security. So, for example, if you have the same password for some random forum and for your bank account, well, the security on the bank account password is only as secure as the security for that forum. Once the attacker has a password that goes with your user account, the attacker might be able to figure out what the next password is, even if you've changed your password. So, for example, if you have a system that requires a password update every 90 days, and the attacker has your old password from another system, which might be mypassword45, and we're a couple iterations past that, it doesn't take a whole lot of guessing to figure out that mypassword46 or 47 or 48 might be the next password in the scheme and might be the password that unlocks it. Note, if you're doing this please don't think that this is an original password scheme. Literally everybody does it, and it's not very secure. An attacker might also turn to exploiting the password recovery mechanism. Sometimes the attacker can use prior victim knowledge for security questions, which are often gleaned from public information. For example, mother's maiden name, oldest sibling's name, so on and so forth. A lot of times you can get that from Facebook, and if all the attacker needs is that information, they pretty much have access to the account right there. Sometimes if the account requires email confirmation, the attacker will be able to compromise the email account and then receive a recovery email to the cracked account. That's a little harder to do since usually modern email services have a little more security around them, but it definitely happens all the time. Some attackers will even hijack someone's phone number and steal the SMS recovery text to get into someone's account. This is why an SMS is not really true two-factor, as it's quite possible for someone to hijack someone's phone number using other compromised information and going directly to the phone company for this attack. It's a little harder to pull off, but it still happens all the time, and so SMS recovery texts are not really true two-factor. If an attacker has been able to limit the scope of the password attempts that they can make, such as finding out a prior password that might be a little too far off to just guess by hand, the attacker might turn to brute forcing the user interface. Often, modern websites will limit the number of access attempts to a certain number in a certain time frame, and so the attacker has to be very specific about the number of combinations that are going to be tested or allow for a very long time frame. While an attacker could be using prior research to find root words that victims are often using in their passwords, there are other techniques. For example, an attacker could use a tool called QUL, which will identify candidate words from a website. Organizations tend to use their own names and key product terms in their passwords. I know I've been part of an organization that's done that. It's a terrible idea, and it's extremely common, but it's something that attackers can use to identify possible passwords. We can do all sorts of neat things with QUL. So we're going to look at using it on the Hack the Box system Apocalypse. We just enter the name of the command and then the IP we want to look at, and it generates our list. We can also dump the same list to a word list file where we can feed it into a password cracker or a permutation generator. We can also use it in GoBuster or DirBuster to help enumerate content. There's a lot of cool things you can do with this tool. To actually execute the attack on the user interface, there are a couple of different techniques that can be used. The first is not exactly optimal, where the attacker can do it by hand or by writing some sort of custom script. That's time-consuming and error-prone, so folks don't really like to do that if they don't have to. They can also turn to tools like Burp Suite Intruder, which is ideal for websites. Now let's see Burp Suite in action. So in the Hack the Box system Nineveh, we found this login page. We're skipping a whole lot of steps, but for now, let's just jump right to it. So we have this login page, and we're trying to figure out what to do with it. I've enabled Burp Suite and set up my proxy in Firefox to route through Burp Suite. So first I'm going to try an admin account, just the admin password. And I can see Burp Suite has picked up my post request here. Admin password, very straightforward. So what I'm going to do is go into my history here. I can see this post that I just sent. I'm going to send that to Repeater. Nope, sorry, I want to send that to Intruder. And then in Intruder, I confirm that I want to go for 10.10.43. I go to the Positions tab, clear all, and highlight where the password is. Now for payloads, I'm going to go over here, and I've already selected a small subset of the Rocky word list. Why only a small subset? You'll see in a minute. I paste that in here, and then we hit start. Now we see this notification that attack times are throttled in the community edition of Burp Suite. You can still see it's reasonably fast, but if you're going through the entire word list or any other word list that has thousands or millions of entries, it's just not going to process in an amount of time that really makes sense. So for a small subset of word lists, you can use it, but bear in mind that there is that high latency. Now, what we're looking for here is the length of the returned message. So we know that password is invalid, and we're getting a response of exactly 1941 characters. And we see that same length for everything else. Now, as we go down to the bottom, we see that this final password attempt has a different response length, 302, 210. I bet that that probably is the right password. So we're going to take that password. Going to go back over to our browser, turn off our proxy, put in the password, and log in. We also have the option of working with Hydra, which is a command line tool that allows us to try brute forcing website UIs as well as other common services such as remote desktop, SSH, and so forth. So it's a very flexible platform. However, it is a little tricky to use, so let's take a look. Let's try that same Nineveh example again, but this time with Hydra. The syntax is a little more complicated here. So we want to invoke Hydra, we give the IP, we use the -L flag for the login, and -P flag for the list of passwords we want to try. In this case, it'll be the exact same password set that we tried from Burp Suite example, which is a subset of RockU. And then you have the HTTP post form over here, which has encoded the replacement elements, _user for the login information and _pass for the password information. And then you have this kind of weird syntax here where you put a colon, and then you have whatever string Hydra is looking for to know that the password is invalid. And then this verbose flag here. So let's set it going. Real fast. See, we tried all 26 passwords in about a second. It was extremely quick. Now, let's try it again with the full RockU word list just to show you how fast it can be. Now, it's working through these pretty quickly. We're already through a couple hundred, but out of a word list of 1.5 million, that's still going to take a while. So you get a sense of how long brute forcing a user interface can take. If the attacker is able to steal password hashes through some other vector, they can then try to crack the hashes. John the Ripper is an older tool, but it's very easy to use. Hashcat is a little bit newer, it's a lot faster and more configurable, but it is kind of a pain to work with sometimes. A little bit of advice, if you're going to be doing more advanced CTF exercises or more advanced pen test training, some of the options that are available in Hashcat are necessary, so I would personally take the time to get to learn Hashcat. If the attacker has absolutely no idea what the password might be, they have to try a true brute force attack, where all combinations of all possible characters are tried. For a salted hash with a proper mix of special characters, upper and lowercase letters, and numbers, the attacker is probably going to die of old age before the hash is cracked on commodity hardware. Therefore, the more specialized bad guys are often using custom hardware and doing other things to reduce the key set to something that can be attacked in a reasonable amount of time. By convention, usually if a password crack is included in a basic capture the flag exercise, the RockU word list in Kali is the way to go. However, it's kind of scary how many people still use passwords from that list in the real world, and so real attackers will often try that word list because it surprisingly can be effective. A little more sophisticated attacks require building a password schema from common words, word misspellings, and special character positions, which can radically reduce the key set for a password to something a little more crackable. For example, if you know that most people tend to do something on the order of a dictionary word or some misspelling of a dictionary word, followed by a special character, followed by some number of numbers, then you've reduced the key set dramatically. You don't need to worry about the special character being in the first position or in the last positions. You don't need to necessarily worry about the numbers being someplace in the word unless they make sense from one of the common misspellings. And there, you've taken many, many orders of magnitude off of the complexity of the password. And from there, you can much more easily crack it. So as a blue teamer, if you want to have a more secure password, making sure you don't follow one of those conventional schemas of having letters grouped up and numbers grouped up and special characters grouped up can really help with the security of your password. Now let's try out John the Ripper again to crack a hash. So first we're going to try encoding the password butterfly as a MD5 into this hashes file. And now let's try using John. So we tell John which word list to use, the Rocky word list, and we're going to give it this hashes file. And we can see here that it's a little bit ambiguous. It doesn't necessarily know which password type we're trying to use. So we want to tell it to use a raw MD5 format. So we add that clarifying argument. And there, we have the password butterfly. John is very easy to use like that. Sometimes you have to clarify the format of the hash, but oftentimes it will just automatically detect it. Now for Hashcat, let's show off something a little bit more advanced, which shows why the tool is so neat. So in this case, we're showing HackTheBox's delivery system, which is a fun, easy box that was released last year. Now, one of the things that you have to do in cracking this box is you recover a set of hashes and then you need to crack them, but the standard Rocky word list doesn't do it. So what you can do is find that there's a password scheme that the password follows, and so what you do is plug in a rule defining that password scheme and use that to crack the hash. So what we're doing is we're saying Hashcat use the bcrypt hash function here with M3200. Now, unlike John, you're not giving a nice human readable name for the hash, you're giving this number. So that's definitely not a super user friendly feature, but you know, it works. And then giving it the hash file that we're looking for here, as well as a root set of passwords. Now, the -R flag here is giving a rule, which this is a fairly broad one. Honestly, it's broader than we necessarily need for this particular exercise, but it allows for broad permutation of the passwords in that PWS file. And then let's real quick show the contents of that PWS file. So we can see that please subscribe and you've got mail are root passwords that we suspect are in use. So what the rule is going to do is take those passwords and do permutations on them and try them against the hash. So let's go back up here to Hashcat and take off the show flag. So what we can do here is see that the Hashcat has ingested the rule file. There were some invalid rules in there that it's skipping. You can see the rule file is quite big, so it's jumping over a bit. But once we let this run, it will give us the password. And a 15-minute jump cut later, we have the password cracked. So we can see that please subscribe, exclamation point 21 turned out to be the correct answer. Now, obviously, a much more straightforward rule could have cracked this as well, one that simply incremented numbers at the end of the root password. However, I want to do something a little more complicated to show that in a more realistic key space, there's a lot more options and it can still take quite some time, even with only 2 password roots. Now, we can see here through the log a couple of iterations here. Like, for example, the engine is subtracting letters here, doing some misspellings and so forth. It's applying numbers to the end. It's replacing letters randomly. There's lots of really neat things that these rule engines can do, prepending entire words like this, throwing in duplicative letters. So you can see that even fairly modest changes to the word, some of which seem like they would be fairly hard to guess, really, they're not that substantially different, and a computer is able to programmatically guess and iterate over potential combinations off of your root word. So if that root word or root password is identified, then, a rules engine like this is able to iterate over it and try out different permutations, and in a relatively small amount of time, actually crack the password. If it had to go through the entire key space, this engine here would have taken about an hour and 20 minutes, which still is not really all that much time in the grand scheme of things. Now that we've seen how attackers operate, let's figure out how to keep our own passwords safe. As a system maintainer, if you find yourself in a position to set security policy, then try to avoid allowing people to guess usernames if possible. So if you can set up your system in a way that allows you to obfuscate what usernames are used to log into the system, that's ideal. Like if you can present, a first name or something for a blog entry instead of what their actual username is, something like that can help slow down the attack chain process by adding more guesswork in. You also always wanted to change the default password. So if your system unfortunately comes bundled with a default password, change it. Just first thing out of the box, change the default password. Also set up your system to lock after a certain number of login attempts. This will block someone, or at least frustrate someone trying to brute force a UI, because it will require them to slow down and really stretch out their attempts to log in. And if you can do that long enough, you can make it impractical to attack with that vector. You can also use services to see if your users are reusing passwords and then force them to use a password that they haven't used before and that hasn't been compromised on the dark web. So what these services will do is buy up password dumps on the dark web or troll forums and so forth, and just keep an idea of what passwords are out there and available. And if they see that a particular user, usually by email, has used a password before, then they can say, you're trying to use a password you've used before. Hackers already know about it. You probably shouldn't be doing that. And if your service can check to see if a password has already been leaked, you can force the users then to use something more secure. You also want to force strong passwords, which is where the user has to use special characters, numbers, uppercase and lowercase letters, and so forth. That's not perfect because people need some way of remembering things, and so usually they'll use some dictionary word with some common misspellings, followed by a special character, followed by numbers. Sometimes they'll flip that order around, but there's a general heuristic that people tend to use, and it's very hard to programmatically enforce greater complexity than that, but it's still better than just using a standard dictionary word. Now, in terms of how you store passwords securely, that's honestly its own topic, and so stay tuned for that. We'll cover that in a later module. Now, if you as a user are creating a password, you want to go beyond the literal requirements of the password and look at the structure itself and make it hard to guess. So taking a root password word, creating permutations of it, and then incrementing numbers, just don't do that. Everybody does it. Everybody thinks they're being clever with it. It's not a good idea to do that because hackers can attack that quite easily once they know what the root word is. And even just knowing that there is a root word and then there's some sort of special character and then numbers or some combination of that where you're otherwise breaking up the structure of the password with special character breaking up, delineation of numbers and letters, that kind of information dramatically reduces the key set. So following that standard structure allows the attacker to use heuristics to more easily break the password. Doing something, a little more sophisticated, for example, like chaining like a passphrase interrupted periodically by special characters and numbers in between the words, that all by itself is much more secure because then it doesn't have that regular structure of, word, special character, number, or vice versa. It almost goes without saying, but don't reuse passwords. Use unique passwords for different services. Or at the very least, one of the things that you can do if you don't want to go all the way and have different passwords for everything is having sort of a hierarchy of passwords where maybe you've got a throwaway password for forums and something that doesn't really have PII, and then you use unique, highly secure passwords for banking, Amazon, and so on and so forth. Just keep in mind that your password is only as secure as the least secure service that has that password. And then if a service is ever compromised, replace the password immediately, replace the password across all platforms that are using it. If you do happen to have other platforms using it, and then never use that password ever again. Now, securing your account recovery is just as important as the password itself. If you have to use security questions, don't use obvious information. Consider even having a fictional bio if some of the security questions are too generic and easily guessed. For example, if you have to have your mother's maiden name, well, maybe you shouldn't actually use your real mother's maiden name, and maybe it should be some fictional persona that no one else knows. I've done this before, and as long as you have some fictional persona that's fixed in your memory as you are answering security questions for this fiction, and no one else has any idea who that is, that's going to be way more secure than using your own information, because somebody can just go on Facebook and crack that. Also, SMS is not true two-factor, and it's not really all that secure. It's better than nothing, but realistically, if you can use an authenticator app or a specialized hardware appliance, that's really much more secure. Something to keep in mind as well is be cognizant of your own email security. Many institutions will use your email as a secure password recovery mechanism, and you can't turn that off. That's just how passwords are securely recovered, and so your security is only as secure as your email. So really try to have two-factor authentication and true two-factor authentication on your email services. In the next episode, we'll talk about phishing, how attackers launch phishing attacks, what kind of payloads do they use, and how can you mitigate the risk from attacks. This is a really complicated topic, so we'll just be touching on the basics next time, but it'll give you an idea of how this common toehold is achieved.